Hi, and welcome to the Outcome Harvesting introduction. So my name is Dina Chen. I work for the Program Quality and Support Unit in Oxfam Novib as MEL specialist, and I will introduce you to the methodology of outcome harvesting. So the first part that I would like to go more into is what the key challenges are for MEL and influencing. So this will provide a bit of the background, as outcome harvesting is a methodology specially designed for influencing work and influencing interventions. So when we are talking about MEL and influencing, there are some specific challenges that are present. So especially when we do influencing work, one of the things that can be difficult to determine is the causal relationship. So how do we link advocacy and the outcomes as we are working in a very complex environment? And furthermore, defining how success look like can be tricky as it varies depending on who is asked the question. So the goal can often shift depending on circumstances, and what looks like success for one person might be different for another. Furthermore, often in influencing, you will have many different approaches and interventions. So for instance, lobbying, advocacy, or campaigning. And therefore it can be difficult to assess which of these approaches lead to most impact as you're using a combination of different approaches. When we do influencing, oftentimes the results showing is also long-term. So change can be slow and incremental. As we are working on political actors and in a social environment, achieving goals can take many years, and oftentimes monitoring and evaluation data are required from the donor before the long-term goal is achieved. So that also poses a challenge in terms of the type of changes you capture. And we also work in changing circumstances in many of our projects. So it's often as new circumstances arise. So in that sense, you need to be flexible. Finally, often being doing influencing means engaging in a process that to the consequences. So it's a conflicting political process. So this is a bit of the setting in which that we are doing influencing work and in which our develop a tool. So maybe also start here by saying that outcome harvesting, even though it is developed for influencing work and very suitable for influencing outcomes, it also captures other type of results. So these can, for instance, be capacity strengthening outcomes, or it can be outcomes in terms of achievements in other areas, such as building alliances, etc. So I will unpack a bit more what type of outcomes it is that we are capturing in outcome harvesting in this presentation. Okay, so a bit more of a background of different type of contexts that we are implementing in. So there are simple and complex interventions. Here we have a simple situation. So in this image, we have a very calm sea, we have a blue sky. We plan to reach the island on the other side of the sea in this made up situation. And because the surroundings are rather calm, we can calculate with quite a big certainty how difficult it will be to cross the sea how much energy and time we might need, and we can also assess whether it will be best to swim or maybe row or sail or take a motorboat. And this is because the relationship of the cause and effect are known. We can, in this case, plan with quite a certainty how to get to the island from the shore, because we have these more reliable contextual factors and circumstances. However, in a complex situation, then in this scenario, we want to go to an island on the other side of the sea. We assume there's an island on the other side of the sea, but because the water is very wild, and we have also very misty, cloudy weather, it's much harder to calculate when we will arrive, how we will arrive, what will be the best way to get there, what is the most effective approach. And this is because in this scenario, the relationships of cause and effect are unknown. So if we take on certain approaches, we don't know if that will lead to certain results, because there are so many complex factors at play here that would have an influence on the work that we are doing. And that is also specifically when we are talking about influencing. So as mentioned before, these can be very challenging circumstances that we are working in influencing. And that is because we are dealing with people and the social world, which is very unpredictable. So the people we want to influence might change their status from being very powerful to less powerful. And in these cases, you will have to adjust your strategy. And when the context is rapidly shifting, a lot of things might play a role in terms of whether you actually will reach results. So to elaborate a bit more how do we then relate to these different type of situations, whether simple or complex, with regards to monitoring and evaluation. So when we are talking about a simple intervention, so this was the scenario with the calm sea, then in these cases, we can use this traditional MEL approach. So this is where it's very much a log frame thinking. So as you are also using a log frame in your project, you probably have designed certain steps that you are planning, or you are thinking of achieving along the way. So in this context, I will use an example of a safe water project, for instance. In this case, we have some inputs, which is, for instance, chlorine tablet that will be handed out to the community. So this is basically the material resources that we put in. And then the activity will be to hand in these chlorine tablets that will provide clean water. And then you have outputs. So outputs can, for instance, be the number of community awareness meetings that were done, or the number of chlorine tablets handed out. And that will lead to outcomes. We assume that, for instance, could be that more households are now using chlorinated drinking water, and the increase in number of households using treated water directly impact on fewer cases of people suffering from diarrhea, for instance, and that again will lead to a reduced number of lost man working hours. So these are different outcomes that could come from that. And then finally, on impact level, this is very long-term changes we are talking about. And we assume this will have an impact on poverty reduction, for instance. So this is more of a simple intervention where you can foresee to a certain extent what will happen once you implement some activities, and that leads to some immediate outputs and outcomes. And when we're talking about complex intervention, which is often the case when we are talking about influencing work, or we are implementing in complex circumstances and context. So in these cases, things look a bit differently. So we have a plan, we have a vision, but how to get there is certainly not as linear and predictable. So we see that there are still some inputs in the beginning, and then the activities are taking place that the project has planned. But what happened then is that we see some of the activities lead to output, others don't. And outcomes also emerge at unpredictable places. So some outputs lead to outcome, others don't. Some outcomes emerge where we don't foresee it. And this is often the case when we start applying our work, that we realize, okay, there's a lot that is outside of our control, and many things changes along the way. And this is basically, you need to keep on adapting to these changes in the environment around you. So I guess that probably you will recognize these cases where of complex situations where things don't always turn out the way as planned. And this is where outcome harvesting comes in as a methodology to respond to these kind of complex interventions. So what is outcome harvesting then? Having provided a bit more of the background, I would like to introduce the methodology. So for Mill, outcome harvesting represents a paradigm change, basically from focusing on what one does, so this is the activity and output level, to focusing on what one achieves. So as the name also suggests, this is very much focusing on outcome. So we want to harvest the outcomes that result from the project. So outcomes are basically used as the indicators of progress. So we use the outcomes that we achieve along the way to understand how far we are in the project and whether we are moving towards the goals that we want to achieve. And the tool as such is quite a participatory tool to make sense of these outcomes when relationships of cause and effect are unknown, so in these complex situations. And it's participatory because the people who collect these outcomes are basically everyone who is knowledgeable about the project, who is included in the project. And what really differs with outcome harvesting from other Mill tools and methodologies is that outcome harvesting doesn't measure progress towards predetermined outcomes of objectives. So it doesn't look at the log frame that is designed at the beginning of the project with certain outcomes and outputs already predetermined and then say how far are we in reaching them. Instead, what outcome harvesting do is to collect evidence of what actually has been achieved. So we are looking at a snapshot of the current moment. So for instance, 2 years into the project, we are having a look at, okay, what can we actually observe of what has already been achieved, rather than what we plan or what we think or want to achieve. So we are instead working backwards to determine whether and how the project has already contributed to change and what kind of change. And when we talk about outcome harvesting, these outcomes can be both positive and negative, and also intended or unintended. So especially the unintended part here is important because as shown in this previous slide, oftentimes we cannot predict where the outcomes emerge. So these can be unintended outcome that wasn't planned in the log frame in the beginning of the project, but nonetheless still very important potentially for the result you want to achieve. So we want to broaden our scope to also take into account the unexpected outcome to capture really the whole range of results that we have achieved. So in order to really understand outcome harvesting, it's important to first determine or create a common understanding of what an outcome is and how that differs from output, for instance. So I will take a bit of time to elaborate on that. So when we start to talk about the different levels of results, the first one is the output level. So here, this is also here where we have the inputs and activities, and then which are leading to our output. So for instance, an example can be if we're taking the example of a workshop, then the input you want to put in is basically you need a trainer, you need a venue if it's a face-to-face workshop, and you need to have certain materials posted, etc. The activities in this case would be to actually facilitate the workshop and to make sure that it's completed successfully. And then the output of the workshop, so that is the immediate result of the activity, will be, for instance, increased knowledge among the participants in the topic of the workshop. So all these three elements are within the sphere of control. And why is that the case? And that's because we, when we implement the activities, have a relatively high extent of control over whether the activities will be completed, but also we can control the immediate output. So for instance, in this case, we can, control if the quality of the workshop is good, then we can assume that people will have increased knowledge. And also we can control how many participants will be there. So this is still a level of results we can have some control over. When we then talk about outcomes, so outcomes are not seen immediately after the end of the project activity as the output. But this is something that we can maybe see more with time. And if I stick with the example of the workshop, then an outcome in this case will be that the participants now start to use this knowledge, they start to apply it in their work. So let's say it was an influencing workshop, then the outcome will be that the participants are starting to do more influencing work. They are starting to apply the tools in the work that they do to get more successful results, to achieve policy changes, to achieve increased political will. And this is within the sphere of influence. So in this case, we cannot control whether the participants will actually use the knowledge that they have gained. So this is a behavioral change that we can hope that they will actually, leave the workshop, find it useful, and then apply these knowledge, skills, tools. but we cannot control that. It's only something we can influence. And then finally, we have the sphere of interest. So this is really the impact level, and this is usually more long-term, more indirect effects of the outcomes. Sometimes you also would, it's also normal that it might not be achieved within the life cycle of the project and program. So this is very much the broader effects and can be more difficult to measure. So this is within the sphere of interest. So in the case of this workshop, then the impact might be improved policies leading to better lives, or more inclusion of women in decision making, let's say, if it's about gender inclusion. But this is very much a longer term effect, potential effect. So we have an interest in this is happening, but we can not necessarily influence it and not control it either. All right. So also to zoom in on the outcome elements, what do we mean with an outcome then? So that is when social actors take action to change the way they do things. So the social actors can be an individual, a group, a community, an institution or organization. So it can be any relevant actor that you are targeting or working with. So this could also be a private company, for instance. And the change that we observe can be, for instance, change in agendas, actions, relationship, practices, policies. It can also be behavior, for instance. And so basically, in one sentence, with outcome harvesting, we want to know, what do other people do differently, and how far is it because of our work? So what changes do social actors take because of our work? And there are some different elements of an outcome. So in outcome harvesting, an outcome is defined as the observable change in agenda, behavior, policy, or practice. So the key word here is that it has to be observable. So we can only identify what we see. For instance, we cannot harvest attitude changes because this would be subjective, someone's attitude. For instance, attitude towards gender equality. But if that attitude change are converted into behavioral change. So for instance, a dad, he changes his attitude, increasingly believes that it's important that women and girls, they gain education and they contribute to the labor market, for instance. Then the behavioral change could be that he starts sending his girl to school. So that would be an observable change, that now more girls are in school, for instance. And then another part is that it has to be, the outcome has to happen in another social actor. And what we mean with another is that it cannot be a partner who is contracted by a project, or it cannot be within the project itself to change, because these are, as a project staff, as a partner, you're already incentivized to wanting to contribute to this change because this is the goal of the project. So this has to be someone external to the project that this change can be observed in. Otherwise, it would still be within the sphere of control if we are talking about change in project staff, for instance. And then furthermore, it should contribute to one or more of the objective of the project's TOC. So in here, this is really about the relevance of the outcome. So why is this outcome relevant to Harvest? So this has to be aligned with what the project is working towards and the goal or the objective that is set in the TOC. And then finally, the outcome should also contain to which extent the project has contributed, or the link between the outcome and the project contribution should be plausible. So it should be plausible that the activities, the interventions being implemented by the project has some kind of relation, has contributed in some way to this outcome, to this change. And so what level of outcome do we harvest in outcome harvesting? So where do we set the bar? We would like to, in outcome harvesting, basically, the smaller changes or more, we can call them process outcomes, we can call them emerging outcomes, we can call them initial outcomes, but these are basically all the steps, all the changes you see as steps on the way towards the greater goal, greater objective. These are also very valuable in outcome harvesting, in understanding where the project is going, also to understand what the projects are achieving. So oftentimes when we when we use monitoring and evaluation to measure progress, then we're focusing on the intended outcomes. So these are the ones that might be predetermined in the log frame, in the theory of change, and then we focus on these ones. But then we forget about all the other achievements that we also actually gain on the way, and these are also important, and also especially for learning, for understanding what is actually happening rather than what we were planning for it to happen. So for instance, an example can be that the great outcome we want to see is is policy change within a certain area. So one of the steps of getting there can be that CSOs come together jointly for the first time to develop a joint influencing strategy. So even though this is not maybe a policy change already, but this is already the first outcome showing that an achievement of bringing together CSOs that maybe didn't collaborate before for the first time, and in developing a joint influencing strategy, they become a stronger influencing voice and stronger influencing actor in their work. In the last slide here, I want to just go through the types of outcomes that we capture in outcome harvesting. So these can, as mentioned, be intended or expected. So those that we hope to achieve, those we plan to achieve, but they can also be unintended surprises. So these that we might not have thought of already in the beginning of the project development. And they can be positive as well as negative. And you might think, why would I want to capture the negative outcomes? And these are also the ones that are of the most difficult to harvest. because there's not the motivation to do that. However, from a learning perspective, these negative unintended outcomes can be very important to understand what went wrong, and also why it happened the way it did. And only if you capture them, you are also able to adapt your interventions and activities to ensure that these negative outcomes don't happen in the future. And these can often be unintended due to contextual changes, due to negative factors in the context. So these are shouldn't be seen as failures, but more like areas where things didn't go as planned due to factors outside of the control. And how can we use that knowledge to learn to adapt, so we increase the effectiveness of our program. So for now, I will stop this part of the presentation, and for the next session, I will go more into, I will introduce the outcome statement. So this outcome statement is the way that we actually document these outcomes. And also I will dive a bit more into contribution of the project. So how do we actually determine, or how do we understand whether whether it's plausible that the project has contributed to the outcome or not. And finally, I will spend a bit of time on evidence and sources for the outcomes. So this is for the next session. See you then.